Staunch atheists show higher morals than the proudly pious from the pandemic to climate change. This is an article by Phil Zuckerman. He is, I believe, an atheist and a secular humanist, and he says, when it comes to the most pressing moral issues of the day, hardcore secularists exhibit much more empathy. So this article is seeking to make the case that it's actually the more secular-minded people in American culture who are more moral, have a greater moral proclivity than those who are very religious and are very devout in their faith. Before we look at this article in a little bit of detail, I want to thank my viewer, Jared, who originally is from the Pacific Northwest, I believe, and he sent me a Seattle Mariners hat to add to my MLB hat collection. Thank you so much, Jared, for doing that. I really appreciate your generosity and the opportunity to connect with someone else who watches my videos. And I thank all of you who watch these videos, who like, comment, share these videos. It really means a lot to me. So I wanted to look at this article because, first of all, I think it gives you a window into how secular people think about Christians, especially evangelical Christians, but also because I think it really helps us see a perspective that is a growing trend in the United States of America. More and more people are looking at things the way that you see in this article here, which in a way is, from a Christian perspective, kind of depressing. But at the same time, we need to realize and remember this is the world that we live in, and this is the culture that we're engaging as Christians. So I won't read everything in this article, but I wanted to highlight some things so you get a feel for it and wanted to make some comments on it. He says, 2 recent events have shed an illuminating light on who is and who isn't moral in today's world. What's interesting is that he's already framing the issue here as if there are some people who are moral and some people who are not moral. And I think you can guess, based on what I've already read, as to who the moral people are and who the immoral people are. He is saying that the moral people would be the secular, atheist, agnostic people in America, and that the immoral or less moral people would be the devout Christians. And he's going to highlight here the issues of COVID-19, the pandemic, as well as climate change. Those are 2 issues that he specifically targets. He does define who he is talking about here. He says, before proceeding, let me make it clear, when I say the most secular among us, I mean atheists, agnostics, people who never attend religious services, don't think the Bible is the Word of God, and don't pray. So that is one end of the spectrum. And then he says, by the most devout among us, I mean religious fundamentalists who believe in God without any doubts, who attend church frequently, who consider the Bible the infallible Word of God, who pray a lot, and who insist that Jesus is the only way, the only truth, and the only life. And then he says a little later, think of it like 2 ends of a spectrum, with one end representing the staunchly secular and the other end representing the deeply devout. Most Americans fall somewhere in the middle. But the nuns and the moderately religious together comprise the majority of Americans. But as to those who occupy the endpoints of the spectrum, it is, as stated above, the affirmatively godless who are exhibiting greater moral proclivities in our nation today than the proudly pious. So that is really his thesis in this article, is that if you look at the ends of the spectrum in the viewpoints of Americans, it's actually people who are the secularists who show a greater moral proclivity and propensity than people who are strong believers in Christianity, is really what he's talking about here. So he's going to talk now about the global pandemic, and I am going to look at this paragraph, but not every paragraph in this article. But looking here, it kind of gives you an idea of how he frames these issues and how he looks at these things. He says, we can start with the global pandemic. COVID-19 is a potentially deadly virus that has caused and continues to cause dire woe. Surely to be moral in the face of such a dangerous disease is to do everything one can within one's limited power to thwart it. No moral person would want to willfully spread it, bolster it, or prolong its existence. And to that, I actually have to agree. I don't think a moral person wants to spread a disease to other people and get them sick. So where is the immorality of evangelicals? Well, here is how he puts it. He says, when it comes to the battle against COVID-19, it is the most secular of Americans who are doing what they can to wipe it out, while it is the most faithful among us, especially nationalistic white evangelicals, who are keeping it alive and well. One of the things that strikes me is that he says white evangelicals are keeping COVID-19 alive and well, as if it's really white evangelicals who are to blame for the continuation of the spread of this disease. If that were true, then wouldn't you think if you go to another country where you don't have a lot of white evangelicals, then they're not going to have a spread of this disease, or it's not going to be bad in those other countries? But that's clearly not the case. It spreads in other countries too, where there are not white evangelical Christians, or not many white evangelical Christians. The other thing that's interesting about this is he says it is white nationalistic evangelicals that are the problem. It's their views that are the problem. I looked at the link that he gives, and I can't read the whole article because I don't have a subscription, but looking at the part of the article here that I can see, it says that the percentage of white evangelicals who say that they have been vaccinated or plan to get the shot as soon as possible was 56% in June, up from 45% in March. That is tied for the lowest figure among groups included in the survey. So it's not just white evangelicals. It's a tie with other groups, or at least with one other group. It says along with Hispanic Protestants, many of whom are evangelical. So notice here he's really targeting white evangelical, but he's failing to mention Hispanic Protestants, right? So you can see here a definite bias and twisting of the information to create a narrative of people that he wants to target, which, by the way, is an immoral thing to do. Here he is touting his morality and the morality of people from his perspective, but he's clearly targeting people and using selective information to target this group of people. That's not a very moral thing to do. Taking the vaccine saves lives and thwarts the spread of the virus. So too does sheltering in place as directed and wearing protective face masks. And yet, here in the U.S., it is generally the most religious among us who refuse to adhere to such life-saving practices, while it is the most secular who most willingly comply. For example, a recent Pew study found that while only 10% of atheists said that they would definitely or probably not get vaccinated, 45% of white evangelicals took such a position. So clearly he's using certain statistics to his advantage and try to make his point as powerful as possible, and really to make white evangelicals look as bad as possible, as if white evangelicals are not doing anything to try to prevent the spread of COVID-19. He goes on from there, though, to talk about climate change. He also talks about gun control and various other issues, and obviously he's going to present all these things from a politically left-leaning perspective. But you would think when it comes to abortion, maybe he could grant some moral credit to white evangelical Christians, but that is not the case. This is what he has to say about evangelical Christians on the abortion issue. He says, but wait, what about the rights of the unborn? While many people oppose abortion on decidedly moral grounds, it is also the case that many others support the right of women to maintain autonomy over their own reproductive capacities on equally moral grounds. So you can see how he frames the issue right off the bat, that he's saying that there's really an equal morality going on here. But obviously, from the evangelical Christian perspective, we wouldn't say it's an equal morality. If you are talking about a woman's reproductive rights, you're really actually having to compare any rights that she has with the rights of an unborn child, and the fact that you're really talking here about taking human life. So it's not really morally equal. But he's going to actually kind of hit on this a little bit. First of all, by what he says next, he says, hence the deep intractability of the debate, and yet, and this is interesting how he frames the issue, most Americans, both religious and non-religious, do not see the abortion of a non-viable fetus as being akin to the murder of a living human being. So he's really shifting here the focus on a non-viable fetus, as he puts it. But a big question is, what about viable unborn children? Are we all agreed that that is murder? And I think the answer from a left or secularist perspective is that not all of them would agree that that is wrong. So he's kind of side-skirting the issue a little bit there. And yes, we do need to talk about the issue of non-viable fetuses. But clearly, evangelical Christians are trying to take a moral position on the issue of abortion, and they're trying to protect life. You would think he would grant that, but then he goes and actually, he's still going to paint evangelical Christians in a bad light here, even on being pro-life. He says, let's be frank. It is impossible to square the assertion that the strongly religious are pro-life while they simultaneously refuse to get vaccinated, to wear a mask, to fight climate change, to support universal health care, or to support sane gun legislation. So, I mean, obviously, white evangelicals are not pro-life. They just want to kill people. You can see here, I mean, this is just a caricature of the reality. I want to hone in, for example, on the idea of gun legislation and what he's talking about there about gun control. He's kind of making it sound like, I mean, he's definitely making it sound like white evangelical Christians who support the right to have guns, to own guns, are actually people who want to be able to go around killing other people, that is their position, and therefore they're not pro-life. Actually, the position of many evangelical Christians about guns is that they want to have guns not to take life, but to protect life. They want to be protective of themselves and other people against those who would threaten the well-being of others. And you can actually see historically cases where people who made up a certain population, if they were defenseless, could not protect themselves and their rights. So no, the issue for white evangelical Christians who are pro-gun rights, aside from the fact that that actually is something talked about in the Bill of Rights, also from a Christian perspective, I think they would say they're trying to defend life. They want to be protective of others, and they want the ability to protect against people who, if you didn't have guns, you would not be able to protect yourself against them if they were threatening people and threatening the freedoms that we have been afforded to here in our country. But then he summarizes there and he says, to characterize such an agenda as pro-life renders the label rather insincere at best. Again, there's such extreme bias here, as if Christians aren't doing anything to try to prevent the spread of COVID-19. Even if they disagree with some of the political implementations, I think we're all agreed that we do not want to actually purposely spread COVID-19, and we do want to be careful. So after he tries to really paint secularists as being more moral than devoutly religious people, he does have to admit that there is some complexity in the world. He says that in this paragraph. Admittedly, how morality plays out in the world is always complex, with numerous exceptions to the correlations above. And at the end of this paragraph, it's interesting, he actually admits the 20th century has witnessed the immoral, bloody brutality of numerous atheist dictatorships, such as those of the former USSR and Cambodia. I'm glad he's willing to admit that atheism doesn't automatically mean that people are going to be moral. He is trying to push back heavily against the idea that you can't be a moral person if you're an atheist. That's not exactly the Christian position. Actually, the Christian viewpoint about sin is more like this. We think that sin is the idea, not that people are always saying, I'm going to do something wrong on purpose. And there are certainly people who do that, and that is sin. But a more common way that sin exhibits itself is that instead of following this straight line toward what is good, we say, well, actually, I think it would be better if I veered off a little bit this way. And at first, it doesn't seem like it's that bad, but over time, you end up really missing the mark, which is one of the words that's used in the Bible for sin, the idea of missing the mark. And so it's really the idea of twisting what is good. So I'm going to comment on that a little bit more, but let me just finish up reading this article here. He says, however, despite such complexities, the overall pattern remains clear. When it comes to the most pressing moral issues of the day, hardcore secularists exhibit much more empathy, compassion, and care for the well-being of others than the most ardently God-worshipping. Such a reality is necessary to expose, not simply in order to debunk the long-standing canard that religion is necessary for ethical living, but because such exposure renders all the more pressing the need for a more consciously secular citizenry, one that lives in reality, embraces science and empiricism, and supports sound policies, not prayer, as a way to make life better, safer, and more humane. So the answer, he says, basically is we need to become more secular and rely on science more than things like faith and prayer. Sounds good when you read it in the context of how he frames everything. However, again, if you look at the paragraph above, he talked about atheist dictatorships like the USSR and Cambodia. And so one of my major problems with this whole article, aside from the fact that he's twisting things, which is really a form of lying, which is immoral, but the biggest issue is it's a problem that you see all the time with people that are secular. It's this overly optimistic view of human nature. Now, it's true that humans can do some really good things. Even people that don't believe in God can do very good things. But as I said, the problem with humans is not that we just automatically say we're going to do something wrong, but that we veer off from what is good. And when we don't have God as our barometer, you see that happen over and over again in human history. And by the way, even though people will say, well, religious people have done horrible things, the argument I always make is that the concept of God and his morality and the morals and ethics that you see with Jesus, for example, and I think actually at one point he even appeals to Jesus, which is interesting, although he does it in a wrong way. But at least with Christians, you can appeal to a moral standard and say, this is what you're supposed to be doing, and you're inconsistent with the teachings of Jesus. With secular atheism, once they set up a morality, then you really have nothing to appeal to as a higher morality to say, no, you're veering off here, you're going in a wrong direction. And this is the key point, that with atheists or humanists, whether they're atheists or not, secularists, we could put it that way, they always have a morality. And that's the most disturbing thing about this article. It kind of misses the point. If you look at the USSR, for example, which it points to as a bad thing, would you actually think that all of the people who built up that system would have said, no, we don't believe in morality? Or do you think that they would have said, no, what we're doing is good, and the people who don't agree with us and want to follow our system are bad, they are immoral? And what ended up happening with that atheistic, communistic system? A lot of bloodshed. And he seems to miss the connection that that has happened in the past based on some of the same foundations that he's actually advocating for here. Now, of course, in history, it's never an exact duplicate of the past. It's more like history doesn't repeat itself verbatim, but as someone has said, it's more like it rhymes. So it doesn't repeat itself necessarily, but it rhymes, is the way I think one person put it. And I think you see a kind of a rhyming pattern here. And there are actually people who are not Christians who are seeing what's happening in certain segments of our society with kind of a global push and the idea of enforcing certain political philosophies and viewpoints on others. And they're starting to realize that the foundations that the West has held to historically were rooted very deeply in a Christian understanding of the world. And even if they're not Christians, they're really concerned about where things are headed in terms of the new value systems that are being promoted and propped up. And ultimately, what people are fearful of, and should be fearful of, is when these new value systems are established and then they become the grid by which other people are either accepted or rejected, and whether they're seen as something that is good and moral or as a threat to what is good and moral. The problem, even though Christianity says some people are moral and some people are immoral, at least Christianity says we are to treat people as being made in the image of God and treat them with dignity and respect. That's actually a Christian ethic. He's trying to say, well, atheists can hold to that, but then you see the way that he looks at white evangelical Christians specifically, and you can see there is disdain there. And ultimately, I think a sentiment that leads to we need to do something about these white evangelical Christians who obviously are immoral. And if you don't have a Christian ethic, then how do you look at those people? Do you see them as made in the image of God and need to be treated with dignity and respect? Or do you see them as threatening to a political system and a value system that is far superior to anything that these Christians could ever hold to? Well, that's happened in the past. And he doesn't see the connection. So obviously, I'm coming at this from a certain vantage point, and I'm being defensive. I don't think evangelical Christians are always perfect. I've even said in a recent video that we need to really take a look at ourselves. But at least we have a standard by which we can look at ourselves and be repentant and say, yes, we need to be more like Jesus. By the way, when he talks here about compassion and care for the well-being of others, that's really the ethic that he's saying is the key here. The problem with that, though, I think a great example of the dynamics that are being talked about here with compassion and care for others is seen in the way that we deal with our children. And I think most of us as parents know that, of course, compassion for our children is important, and it should be a part of the parent-child relationship. You have this compassion for your children, but that doesn't mean that the best thing for their well-being is always to give them whatever they want and what immediately makes them feel good. Actually, as a parent, sometimes you make decisions that at the moment you feel pretty bad about. You might say, well, I really would like to give my child the thing that they want right now, but I'm not going to do that because that's not actually going to be good for their well-being. So the truth is he's trying to frame these things as being one against the other, but that is not always the case. Yes, it's true that sometimes, yes, as evangelical Christians, we can exhibit a lack of compassion. But I think that that has a lot more to do with getting sucked into politics, and politics can, at times, cause us to look at some people as the enemy in and of themselves when we should look at them as people who we need to have compassion for, and we hope that God will work in their life. We need to genuinely love people, even our enemies, as Jesus said. So that's why I always say put the Bible above politics as a Christian. But even though that may happen at times, in reality, a lot of this has to do with a disagreement on what we think showing compassion and care for the well-being of others is. And that's why I use the example of our children. That I think many Christians are saying for people to really receive the care that they need and to improve their well-being, a lot of times that involves things that are really hard, things that they may not even like. And that's what I think a lot of Christians are actually saying. It's not that they're not compassionate necessarily. It's that they think, well, let's say someone is addicted to alcohol. Well, of course we should have compassion and care about the situation that they're in. However, at the end of the day, what they're doing is destructive. And so them getting out of that is going to take some real change, some real behavioral change, and a lot of things that they're going to have to deal with in order to make those changes. That's what I think a lot of Christians feel about the social ills that we're dealing with in our country, that there are changes that have to be made in people's lives. And it's actually not because we're not compassionate. It's actually that by making these changes, it is best for the well-being of others. So I haven't even looked at this entire article, and obviously I have a lot of thoughts on it, but I've talked enough. I would love to hear what you think about these things in the comment section below. I hope that some of the things that I have said have been insightful and helpful to someone out there. If you are an atheist, agnostic, or secularist, I, of course, do invite you to give comments, but I always say let's try to keep our conversation constructive and helpful. But I do thank you, regardless of what standpoint you're coming from, for taking some time to listen to this topic and some of my thoughts on it, brought to you from A Frisch Perspective.